This tutorial is about duplicate stitch. So on my Madeline sweater, I had to do duplicate stitch on these this little detail that goes up. I call it, I'm calling them icicles, but they're going up instead of down. But this little detail, because you don't want to carry the yarn behind this light colored yarn on top, the main nectar color. So the pattern suggests that you do duplicate stitch for these spiky things, and that's the right thing to do. But you would also do duplicate stitch if you had want to add a little highlight. It could be one stitch every 20 stitches or something like that in a pattern where you don't want to be carrying floats for whatever reason, because it's not efficient to carry them, or because you might see it through behind the fabric. So in order to get the duplicate stitch to look really good, I'm going to give you a couple hints when I do it, but I'm not going to do it in mohair because it's too hard for you to see. So we'll just put the Madeline away for a minute. And I have my trusty swatch. This is the hardest working swatch in the world right now because I've done everything with it, and I have a contrasting yarn that I'm going to use. That's the same weight. So this is our Aran weight. So I have the natural here, and I'm going to do the duplicate stitch with this raspberry cordial in Aran. So let's put my little scissors there, my little rabbit scissors, and I'm going to, I'm using a blunt tip needle, but I'm going to talk about the stitches because you need to understand the anatomy of the stitch to have a good understanding of how this works. So you have your V of your stitches, which most people would recognize, and what you have to pay attention to is that the V, the two legs that join at the bottom of the V, go into the stitch below together in the same hole. The stitch below is wrapped around the back of these two V's. So you can see that the loop wraps around the point of the V on top of it. So when you're doing your duplicate stitch, you actually want to follow the same path that the yarn took when you knit the item. So I'm just going to show you this a couple stitches like this, and you're going to be able to see. So the first thing that you do is you can just you want to get your yarn in a position where I usually do this right when I start. Whoop, it's a little bit thick. So, and then I usually just kind of tack it down, and you can leave a tail and sew in like a thicker tail if you want. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to tack it down, so you can't see that on the other side of the yarn of the project. So I'm going to just pop this needle up somewhere. Okay, I'm going to go up here so that I'm on. These were my left-leaning decreases that I did in a previous tutorial, so I'm just going to avoid those because it's not. So what I've done now is brought the yarn, the contrasting yarn, up through the stitch, and this is the stitch that I'm going to put the duplicate stitch over. So you start at the bottom here, and I'm going to give you a lot of detail because there's some helpful hints that it's not merely just following the yarn. The way that you actually draw the yarn around the stitch makes a difference on how neat your duplicate stitch looks like. So the first thing that I want to do is replicate this leg, the right leg of the stitch. So I'm going to go under the two legs of the stitch on top. Being careful not to catch the yarn underneath, which is the loop. Okay, so, and I'm going to just tighten the tension a little bit in the direction that the yarn would normally go. If you do this, or you do this, or you tighten it in, you need to be gentle with this and patient, then you can get make your tension too tight on the sides of the stitch. So now that stitch underneath the raspberry cordial comes here and it goes back down the same hole that I had come up. Okay, so I'm going to get the yarn kind of in place, and then I'm going to, so on the underside, I'm actually tensioning that stitch in the direction that it would go. So I'm not going over to the side. You see what happens if I pull it to the side? I'm going to just loosen that. You end up with an uneven stitch. So I'm going to tension it in a downward direction. Okay, so now that's the first one. So now I want to do the second stitch. I'm coming up, side there. Okay, so I'm right at the point. I'm going to go under the two legs of the stitch above the one that I'm duplicating, and I'm pulling in a direction that doesn't put an angle on the yarn, and I'm just snugging the tension, but not too aggressively, and I'm going right down where I originally came up, and I'm going to pull downward, not to the side. Okay, now I've got two stitches that are duplicated, and it does give you a little bit bigger, a bigger stitch. It kind of gives it a little bit of a 3D quality, but it's pretty good. And once it's been blocked and everything, it's not really super noticeable on your work. So I'm just going to do that again. So for the next one up, I'm coming up at the bottom of the V's, making sure that the angle, this is a little thick because the yarn is too Aran straight. Oh, there we go. Coming up, and I'm pulling downward, not out to the side, going under. You can see actually the one I'm duplicating, this is the strand right in here. I'm just going to actually show that a little bit more. If I pull these apart, you see the strand there. And I'm just, now that I've picked up the strand, it's okay. I'm tensioning to the side, and I work it a little bit with my finger just to make sure that it's in a good position, and I'm coming down in the hole that I had originally come up in, and when I get close, I'm tensioning downwards, pulling the stitch downwards. Okay, so I'm going to just do a couple more. Up in the center where the point of the V is, tensioning down, across, tensioning across, and back in the same hole that I had originally come up. And as I get close to the tensioning part, I'm going to tension in a downward direction so that you can see that this is all, it's all pretty even. So this one is a little bit bigger, and you can actually go back and play a little bit with the tension under here to tighten that up a little bit if it bothers you. You can figure out how it goes. This one goes under here. So you can just tension that a little bit more. All right, so there's, now when you're counting how many you've done, it's kind of, because these end up being quite close together, it sometimes can be hard. There's 4, obviously, but I often look here at the next stitch beside the row that I'm doing. So it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4. It's easier almost to see it in the original stitches than the ones that you're doing. So that's how you do duplicate stitch. You can move over rows So you would just come up on the next row and you just do the same thing under the stitch, the two legs of the stitch on top of the one you're duplicating, and back down. Oh, I went to the side, so you see what happened. It skewed the stitch a little bit. So I'm just going to retension. Okay. And then you can continue doing the same thing up. I find it's easier to, or I always do it, going up the row. I'm sure that there's a way to do it in the opposite direction, but I find that this gives me the neatest look. So if I actually had to go, unless I was making a whole line across, I would probably find my path so that I had a way to do all of the stitches up in a row first, and then I might even break the yarn and start another row if I had to go side by side. Okay, so that's duplicate stitch, and I hope you find that helpful. Thanks.